Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. Today's topic comes to us from commenter Poppin, who has made a few excellent suggestions in the past. This is no exception. Poppin has asked for a video about the awakening of the elves and the origin of the various elven clans. So, here we go. We're going to try this. And I'm going to try not to make this sound like a desk reference. We're going to lean into math. We'll probably have some flowcharts. I need a flowchart team. Oh, that's right. It's just me. Oops. Okay. But in any case, so I'm going to try to keep this from sounding too much like I'm reading an encyclopedia. There's a lot of names that go on here, but it is really fascinating. And the various elven clans have a lot to do with the state of affairs in the Lord of the Rings. So we begin in the years of the lamps. This is way, way back, way before the First Age, way before the elves even. And at this point, the world is lit by these two giant lamps. I've done a video on this. Check it out if you want to know more info on that. But eventually Melkor destroys those lamps, takes them out, and destroys a lot of the world in the process. The world has changed, geography shifts. The Valar replace the lamps with two trees that they plant in Aman in the west. Over here in the Middle Earth, it's just twilight. There's no actual, there's no major light source. We don't have the sun and the moon yet. That's coming later. Under this twilight, there is this very large inland sea over here in Middle Earth. It is called the Sea of Helkar. And that sea was formed when one of the lamps collapsed. So it's the remnants of what happened when a lamp was destroyed. On the shores of that giant inland sea is this place called Cuiviénen. And Cuiviénen is where our elves first awaken, in what is actually the years of the trees. So the very first information we have about the elves awakening was actually written by Tolkien much later than most of the other information he wrote. One of the last things he wrote about was this very first moment of elven consciousness, because he'd already written a lot about the elves and the clans and such. And so I think kind of to hedge his bets, because he was kind of retconning history, his own myth, he describes these first moments of elven consciousness. But the way he describes it is he says, this is a legend within a legend. So this is an elven legend that's actually intended to teach elven children math skills. All right, so that's where so I think that was his way of going, hey, this may or may not be true, but I'm going to write it, and it's kind of cool, and maybe there's some basis in truth, but just in case it doesn't quite line up, just know it's just intended to teach elven kids math, so, don't hold me to it. Okay, so with that disclaimer, the way he describes these first moments are that the very first elf to awaken on the shores of Cuiviénen is an elf he names Imin, which means first. Imin awakes. His wife is by his side, Iminye, still under the twilight, obviously. And there are two other elves, Tata and Enel, second and third, that both awaken as well. Tata the elf sounds like a burlesque name, but whatever. It's Imin, Tata, and Enel. Those are your three, and their wives. So there's 6 elves that are now awake on the shores of Cuiviénen. And they start wandering around the shoreline to see if there's any other elves in the area. There are. This is where the math comes in. I'm great at math, but no, I'm not. There are 144 total elves at this location. And basically all the elves that come for thousands of years later all start with someone in these 144 elves, led to Legolas and Galadriel and all that stuff. So these 3 elves, Imin, Tata, Enel, go walking around and are basically calling dibs on groups of elves. So the first group they come to, they see 12 elves on the ground, kind of starting to wake up, and Imin says, dibs! And so he gets his clan, and that continues. As it turns out, Imin keeps waiting for what he thinks is going to be some giant cache of elves, and so he keeps passing his turn, and it never comes around that there's any more elves. So he is left with the smallest group, which is 14 elves. The 12 he chose, his wife, and himself. And they are named the Minyar, after him, Imin the Firsts. The second group is larger, the Tatyar, named for Tata, and his wife. They are total 56 elves of this 144. That means the rest, which would be the largest group, are the thirds, the Nelyar, and they total 74 elves. So we got 14, 56, 74. I think that totals to 144 elves. Math, great. Okay, anyway, so there they are. They're conscious, they're awake. They're a little confused because at this point, the Valar are not in Middle-earth. They're way over on Aman, and they're enjoying the light of the trees. But they're also in hiding somewhat from Melkor. Melkor's on the loose in Middle-earth. Melkor finds them first, makes them fear, actually captures some of them and tortures them into orcs. There's a lot of fear and mistrust and confusion going on in these three clans, the Minyar, the Tatyar, and the Nelyar. Eventually, one of the Valar, Orome, the huntsman, comes over, finds these elves, communicates with them. They're afraid of him, he and his horse, because Melkor has taught them to fear. He kind of consoles them, and he rides back to Aman to let Valar know, hey, the elves, the children of Iluvatar, they're awake, and Melkor's doing bad things to them. The Valar take that information and end up beginning the war for the sake of elves against Melkor. They capture him, imprison Melkor, and then they summon the elves to come to the west, to come witness the light of the trees. But the elves are wary of the situation. They don't just readily accept this summons. They've kind of been burned by Melkor, and they're fearful. And so I'm going to read you a passage here that kind of describes how the Valar attempt to convince the elves to come west. But the elves were at first unwilling to hearken to the summons, for they had as yet seen the Valar only in their wrath as they went to war, save Orome alone. And they were filled with dread. Therefore, Orome was sent again to them, and he chose from among them ambassadors who should go to Valinor and speak for their people. And these were Ingve, Finve, and Elve, who afterwards were kings. And coming, they were filled with awe by the glory and majesty of the Valar, and desired greatly the light and splendor of the trees. Then Orome brought them back to Cuiviénen, and they spoke before their people, and counseled them to heed the summons of the Valar and remove into the west. Okay, so summons is made. The elves are like, not so fast. Orome is sent. He chooses 3 ambassadors, and who are future kings, and takes them over to Aman. They see the light of the trees. They're like, whoa, all right, this place is amazing. They come back to kind of spread the word. Yep, it's on the up and up. We shouldn't fear this. This is a good thing. Those 3 ambassadors, as I mentioned, Ingve, Finve, and Elve. Now, why isn't it Imin, Tata, and Enel? That's because at this point, from this point on, we never hear those names again. I think it's because of this retconning, right? Tolkien added these names after he'd already written the rest of the mythology, and so they don't really fit in. There's some people try to think, well, maybe since there's 3 ambassadors and each one's from a different clan, maybe those are just other names for Imin, Tata, and Enel. But it doesn't really fit. There's some reasons, a lot have to do with their wives and such, that doesn't really work. So canonically, it's odd. They just disappear. and are replaced by these other 3 ambassadors. I suppose if you just wanted to throw in a way that it all makes sense, that the canon remains accurate, I think the best way to do that would be to say, hey, when Melkor came along and was trying to capture and torture elves and turn them into orcs, he probably would have focused maybe on the leaders. And so perhaps you could say that Melkor captured Imin, Tata, Enel, and tortured them into orcs. And so they were the progenitors of the orcs, perhaps. That's the way that it all kind of makes sense canonically, I think. Otherwise, you're going to have some hiccups. But in any case, we now pick up with our 3 ambassadors who become very important from then on. Yngve, Finve, and Elve. Yngve is the ambassador for that first group. They were called the Minyar. They become now known as a more familiar name in Tolkien lore, the Vanyar. Those are just the 14 elves. There's 14 of them, and they actually just head straight for Valinor, no stops. They're like, we're in this bandwagon, and they go. I'm going to read you a passage here that kind of sets this out, but just to clarify. So then you've got Finve is the leader of the second group, the Tatyar. They become known by the more familiar name of the Noldor elves. And the third group, the Nelyar, are led by this guy Elve. We're going to see that later he goes by the name Thingol. Thingol, very important name in Elvish lore. He is leading up this third group, the Nelyar, who are also now known as the Teleri, the last. Okay, let me read you another passage here where the elves begin this, what they call the Great Journey West. The Eldar prepared now a great march from their first homes in the east, and they were arrayed in 3 hosts. The smallest host, and the first to set forth, was led by Yngve, the most high lord of all the elvish race. He entered into Valinor and sits at the feet of the powers, and all elves revere his name. But he never came back, nor looked again upon Middle-earth. The Vanyar were his people. They are the fair elves, and few among men have spoken with them. Next came the Noldor, the people of Finve. They are the deep elves, and they are renowned in song, for they fought and labored long and grievously in the northern lands of old. The greatest host came last, and they are named the Teleri, for they tarried on the road, and were not wholly of a mind to pass from the dusk to the light of Valinor. In water they had great delight, and those that came at last to the western shores were enamored of the sea. The sea elves, therefore, they became in the land of Aman, the Falmari, for they made music beside the breaking waves. 2 lords they had, for their numbers were great, Elve and Olve, his brother. So that just kind of spells out generally how these tribes are approaching the west. That small group, the Vanyar, they take off for the west, no problems, and all of them go as a block. Yngve is their leader. Second group, the Noldor, they also pass off to the west, although some of them decide not to go. So there's a portion of the Noldor and a portion of the Teleri, our second and third groups, that decide, nope, we like the twilight, we like this open space, you're not going to take us from our home. Those are called the Avari, or the unwilling. There's I think it's 56 of the 144 elves decide, nope, you can't convince me, we're staying. That's a large group. And those elves never see the west. I'll talk more about them in a second, but the Avari are kind of in their own separate subgroup, the Venn diagram. they circle in with a little bit of the Teleri and a little bit of the Noldor, but they're the Avari. They're off on their own. Okay. Of the that third group, the Teleri, that decide, all right, we are going to go to the west, they set out on their journey, leaving the Avari behind. They reach the Misty Mountains we know from the Lord of the Rings. I think at this point those mountains are much taller. And some portion of these Teleri elves are like, no, we're not passing over these mountains. It's dangerous. No, it's too much effort. We're just going to stay here and near the Anduin in this valley area. So those elves become known as the Nandor. The Nandor elves, eventually, those are the elves that become the elves we know of as like the woodland elves, the sylvan elves, the elves of Greenwood, the elves of Lorien. That's where this group comes from, the Nandor elves, which are a subset of the Teleri. I know I'm throwing out a lot of names here, flowcharts, but I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. Okay, so the Nandor stay. The rest of the Teleri keep going. They cross the mountain. They get all the way to the coast. Now, what happens on the way, though, is that of course, I mentioned they have two leaders, right? They have their brothers, Elve and Olve. Elve, I'm going to call him Thingol because that's kind of what he's better known by in the lore. He becomes lost. He ventures into this particular forest, Non-Elmoth, where he meets his future wife. She is a Maya, one of the Maya spirits, who's come over to Middle-earth, loves being in this twilight world, and when they meet, there's an enchantment that comes about. I'm going to read you a little passage about this enchantment, because it has a big part to play in how these elves migrate. When it starts with "She spoke no word," it's talking about Melian. This is this Maya spirit that eventually marries Thingol. She spoke no word, but being filled with love, Elve came to her and took her hand, and straightway a spell was laid on him, so that they stood thus while long years were measured by the wheeling stars above them. And the trees of Non-Elmoth grew tall and dark before they spoke any word. Thus Elve's folk who sought him found him not, and Olve took the kingship of the Teleri and departed. Elve came never again across the sea to Valinor, so long as he lived, and Melian returned not thither, while their realm together lasted. Okay, so yeah, he comes into this forest, Non-Elmoth, and meets up with Melian, and when they touch hands, they freeze in place. They don't say a word. They're basically frozen in place. The trees grow around them. It's about 20 years. It may even be more than that because years are measured differently at this time and the time of the trees. But a whole long time goes by while they just stand there isolated. And the trees have grown up around them so they can't be found. And meanwhile, a good section of the Teleri are looking for their king. Where'd he go? We're not going any further. We want to make sure our king's all right first. So they decide to stay and search for their king. Those elves became known as the Egloth, the Forsaken. And they spent, as I say, many years looking for this king, and they didn't progress, and they ended up staying in Middle-earth. So Olve takes the rest of the Teleri and keeps going to the coast. Gets to the coast of Beleriand. But they have to wait, because what's happening is Ulmo, the Valar spirit of the sea, kind of the version of like Poseidon, what he's doing is he's using an island, the lonely island, Tol Eressëa, as a ferry, essentially. So it's like there's this giant piece of land. It's like, yoink, everybody on? Yoink. And so he took the Vanyar over. Now he's taken the Noldor over. And so there's this period of time where the Teleri are waiting on the shore. Time goes by. Finally, Ulmo comes back. He's like, all right, everybody get on, all you Teleri, get on this my floating island ferry. Some of them do get on that island, but there's a portion of them that are like, you know what, we actually like this coastline. We like this shore area. I think we're going to stay here, thanks. And so they become known as the Falathrum, the coast people. There's good evidence to suggest that amongst these folks is Círdan, the elf that shows up in the Lord of the Rings. It's not said, 100%, but the idea is he is probably one of the original 144 elves. and he becomes the leader of this group. The Falathrum are hanging out on the coastline. So the rest of those Teleri get on the island. Tol Eressëa, Olmo carts them across the sea, parks them just off the coast, off the eastern shore of Aman. That's where Tol Eressëa continues to be for thousands of years after that. And they become known as the Sea Elves, the Falmari. I think I mentioned them in that quote. But the Falmari take up residence there. All right, so that's already kind of confusing, right? The Vanyar are simple. There's 14 of them. Yngve led them off to Valinor, and that's where they stayed. The Noldor had some of the Noldor decided to stay, didn't decide to start making the journey. Those are part of that Avari elves. But most of the Noldor got on that island, ferried across, and ended up in the west. They are led by Finve. That's important for later. So it's this third group that really creates a lot of issues, right? These Teleri elves, confusing things. So just to kind of recap, you got some portion of them didn't even start the trip, right? Those was part of that Avari elves. They're like, nope, we're not going anywhere. Of the ones that decided, all right, we'll try this out, some of them give up pretty quickly. They hit the mountains, they're like, yeah. Those are the Nandor elves. I'll say this, they are led by Lenve. Lenve's son is Denethor. It's the first Denethor we know of. It's the one actually that from which the Denethor of the Lord of the Rings time is named for this guy. But Denethor, son of Lenve, leads another group out of that valley, the Lykendi elves. They become the Green Elves. And so there's a kind of little offshoot there of the Nandor, but they're the Nandor elves. So that is that group that didn't get past the mountains. Then of the Teleri that got past the mountains, some of them did continue all the way to the west. Those are your Falmari elves, the Sea Elves. But some of them, when their leader got lost, decided we're not going any further. Those became the Egloth, our Forsaken Elves. And then another group got to the shoreline, decided we're going to stay here, we're not going all the way to the west, and they became known as the Falathrum. Okay, eventually, Elve wakes up from this enchantment. He and Melian are married, and he shows up. And he ends up uniting the Egloth, the group that was searching for him, and the Falathrum, the group of elves on the coastline of Middle-earth. And they become known as the Sindar, the Grey Elves. They are led by Thingol. And again, I know those Teleri, it's like tick, 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 so many names. But the Sindar Elves is the name they're probably best known by. So there's another term for elves that comes up, Dark Elf. And obviously Dark Elves in gaming culture have a different connotation than they do in Tolkien's mythology. I'm going to read you a passage here. I've actually done a video about Eol the Dark Elf. He actually has that title. And this is a little passage that describes him. And then I'm going to tie this into what the name means. Okay. The trees of Non-Elmoth were the tallest and darkest in all Beleriand, and there the sun never came. And there Eol dwelt, who was named the Dark Elf. Of old, he was of the kin of Thingol, but he was restless and ill at ease in Doriath, and he fled thence to Non-Elmoth. There he lived in deep shadow, loving the night and the twilight under the stars. He shunned the Noldor, holding them to blame for the return of Morgoth. So, yeah, Non-Elmoth, that's that same forest that Thingol met Elian in. They allow Eol to dwell there as well. And so here is Eol, the Dark Elf. It says he is of the kin of Thingol, so he is one of the Teleri elves. But he has kind of shunned society. But the term Dark Elf has, I think, a very specific meaning in Tolkien lore. The Dark Elves are the elves that never got to the west to see the trees, right? So at this point, in the years of the trees, before the First Age, the only real like major light source that we would consider like sunlight bright are these trees. And if you're not in Aman, if you're not in the west, you ain't seeing them. You're only seeing the twilight. And so the elves that did not witness the light of the trees are known as the dark elves. They lived in the darkness. And so that would be those Avari elves, the unwilling. I'm circling like I've got a Venn diagram here. Okay. So the Avari elves never went west. And so they would count in this group of the dark elves. But also these Teleri that didn't get to the west, right? So the Egloth and the Philathrum and the Nandor, they didn't go. So they would also be counted among dark elves. Now what makes it really confusing is that, so that means that the Sindar elves, these guys who are the Philathrum and the Egloth combined under the rule of Thingol, those would be counted as dark elves. But Sindar also means gray elf. So you're like, these are gray elves and they're dark elves. How do those names rectify each other? Well, the reason they're called gray elves, actually there's some discrepancy as to why that might be, but I think the most compelling theory is that Thingol, their leader, his name is translated as gray mantle. And the reason it's so is because he has very long silver hair, which is unusual for the Sindar. They have mostly dark hair. So essentially the gray elves are named after Thingol's hair, which I thought was pretty interesting. So yes, the gray elves are also the dark elves. So I'm not going to go too much into elven history here. This is more about setting up the clans and not so much about all the history of the elves. But I'm going to mention something that's pretty important for how this all shapes out. And that is Finve, our king of the Noldor, his first wife is Miriel. And he and Miriel have Feanor. Feanor, famous or infamous elf, however you want to say it. But Feanor, in the early writings, Tolkien had it that Feanor was the first of the second generation of elf. So you had these 144 elves that were kind of awakened, and then the first elf born of these 144 was Feanor. I think by the time he published Silmarillion, I think that had changed. But just to show you how important Feanor is to the elven myth, when Feanor is born, basically it takes so much of the life force of Miriel to give birth to Feanor that her physical form passes on. She is allowed to fall asleep and die. She doesn't die. I mean, elven spirits go to the halls of Mandos and they wait and get reborn, but her physical form passes on. And she is the first elf to die, to pass on in the West. It's kind of a big shocking deal. All the elves are like, oh my God, what terrible. And so Finve remarries. And the elf that he marries is not one of the Noldor. The elf he marries is one of the Vanyar, so one of the elite firsts. I'm going to read you a quick passage about that real fast. The elf he marries is named Indis. Now it came to pass that Finve took as his second wife Indis the Fair. She was a Vanya, close kin of Ingve the High King, golden-haired and tall, and in all ways unlike Miriel. Finve loved her greatly, and was glad again, but the shadow of Miriel did not depart from the house of Finve, nor from his heart. All right, so he marries Indis. Now Indis, she is a close kin of Ingve. I think at one point maybe she was actually his sister, but again, by the time it got published, close kin is as close as we get. But she is connected to Ingve. She marries Finve, so he's the king of this second group of elves, the Noldor. And what's notable is that she has golden hair. It's one of the interesting things that a lot of the movies get wrong, and depictions of elves in general. Tolkien elves, for the most part, don't have blonde hair. They're either dark or silver, some redheads in there, but the blonde-haired elves are very rare. One of those is Indis of the Vanyar. So she and Finve have a couple of children. One of them is Finarfin. And Finarfin ends up marrying Yarwen. Yarwen is the daughter of King Olve. Remember, that's Thingol's brother, Olve. He went into the west. He took those Falmari sea elves all the way to the west. And so while Thingol was over in Middle-earth, his brother Olve was living in Aman in the west. So Olve's daughter, Yarwen, marries Finarfin. And they have 4 kids. One of those kids is Galadriel. And Galadriel has that blonde hair. She's got the golden hair. And it's so beautiful and rare that it's what inspires Fëanor to create the Silmarils. He asks her for her hair 3 different times, a little lock of her hair, and she refuses him each time because he's creepy. Obviously later in The Lord of the Rings, when Gimli asks for a lock of her hair, she gives him 3. But the reason Gimli is so entranced is this beautiful, almost, godlike hair. But it's blonde, and she is one of the very few blonde elves. And I think that's just kind of interesting. Also, she is a product of the 3 original ambassadors, right? Those 3 kings. You've got, first of all, she's the granddaughter of Finve. So that's the king of the Noldor. She is also the granddaughter of Indis, who is related to the king of the Vanyar elves. And she's the granddaughter of Olve, king of the Teleri. So all 3 of those original clans, their kings, the lineage, is represented in Galadriel. And I think that's, her hair is a metaphor for the fact that she is a very important elf and is a product of the combined excellence of the elves. So what happened to the Avari? Well, the Avari elves ended up commingling with, especially those Nandor elves, the ones that ended up being the Sylvan elves, the elves of Lorien, the elves of Greenwood, Mirkwood. Those have a lot of the Avari elf in them. And so any of the elf races that stayed in Middle-earth usually ended up commingling in some way with the Avari elves. I should also mention a major split between the clans was what they call the first kinslaying. And in that situation, it's Fëanor's Noldor elves basically go to those sea elves, remember the Falmari, and demand their ships. We want your ships. We want to sail over to Middle-earth to deal with Morgoth and get our Silmarils back. And they're refused. Sea elves are like, no, our ships are very important to us. You're not getting them. And so Fëanor starts a battle and kills a bunch of elves. As a result, obviously there's a huge rift. So even when the Noldor have decided, look, we're going anyway, the Falmari decide not to join the Noldor in their attempt to take on Morgoth. And in fact, that act of killing Falmari for not giving them ships kind of dooms the Noldor. We've got the doom of Mandos, where the Valar basically are like, you're exiled. And so when they depart from Middle-earth, they are the exiled Noldor elves. Most of the Noldor follow Fëanor to the east, with the exception that Finarfin actually turns around, and some of his followers, so Finarfin's that one who was Galadriel's dad, he decides, wait, we don't want to offend the Valar, please forgive us, and they are forgiven. But most of the Noldor do go to the east and become the exiled Noldor. As far as the fates of our 3 ambassadors, Yngve of the Vanyar, he is the High Lord of all elves, never perishes as far as we know, stays in the west. Some of the Vanyar certainly come with the Valar over to take on Morgoth for the last time. At the end of the First Age, the War of Wrath, there's the host of the Valar come. So I assume some of the Vanyar elves are in that host. But because that one passage I read you earlier said that Yngve never came back to Middle-earth, I'm guessing he didn't go. He let his minions go do that for him. So that was it. He survived and prospered. Finve was actually killed by Morgoth. Morgoth came to the fortress of Formenos, which is Feanor's exiled fortress, looking for the Silmarils. Found the Silmarils, in the meantime killed Finve. And our good friend Thingol was actually also killed for the Silmarils. He was trying to put the Silmaril into this necklace, the Nauglamir. Had the dwarves do it for him. The dwarves became entranced by the Silmaril. We're like, hey, we want to keep this. And Thingol's like, no, I was having you do that for me. And they in a fight, and the dwarves kill him. And so that starts a lot of the animosity between elves and dwarves. But so that's the fate of your three kings of the original three clans of elves. All right, I know that's confusing. Hopefully that made some sense. And Poppin, I hope that answers your question about the origin of the various elven clans. Thank you so much, everybody. If you've got a topic you'd like me to do a video on, please put it in the comments. I'd be happy to do a video on a topic of your choosing. Thanks, everybody, and have a good one.